So let's start. I'm going to talk today about defending versus turn C bets. When defending versus bets on the river, we look at how often we need to defend in terms of NDF, look at the odds and compare our hand equity versus villain's range. However, this does not work for flop and turn, given that hands still have improvability and boards can still change on the river. Okay, we have to take in consideration, we have to look ahead how the board is going to run out. Sometimes you will find yourself in situations where if you would just look at your odds and look at the equity your hand has versus the range, you would say, okay, it's a call, but it's still a fold because you cannot maneuver enough rivers in a profitable way. Okay, I'm gonna teach you how to look at your hand a bit more in EV than in necessarily absolute hand strength. All right. So I made a little list of considerations when defending versus turn C bets. I think there are 5. Starting with point 1. Does villain bet the same or a worse hand for value? Okay, I just thought about, okay, what are some things that I take in consideration? I personally approach this spot a little bit more exploitative, but I will get to that in a second. But the first thing I usually ask is like, okay, well, you know, what's like the value threshold of my opponent? Is he betting the same or worse hand for value? Because usually if that's the case, it's the same true on the river. Usually you don't really have to think a lot more, and usually you can just continue the hand. That's why I like to usually think about this first. Sometimes, you know, you can end up thinking about a lot of things and then like, oh, wait, you can actually bet the same hand. Better to just start there. Point number 2. Does villain have a significant equity advantage now or in the future? Now, this is very important in terms of flop and turn play. All right. Because if there's a big equity advantage for villain, and the bigger that advantage is for villain, now and in the future, the more and bigger he is allowed to bet. Then the correct play in these situations is to overfold. Okay. On flop and turn, there's many situations, especially actually out of position, where we're forced to overfold if you would compare it to, for example, MDF. Okay, and this is simply because we don't have enough equity. Okay, we're just too far behind. And especially because we're the caller, and especially also if we're out of position, our realization of that equity is going to be very poor. So we have to overfold. And basically, you have many situations where raisers can just bet range. And the reason they can bet range is because they have a significant equity advantage. But the actual reason is that because of the significant equity advantage, we have to overfold. So betting generates a lot of folds, and that's actually why we range bet. Okay. So I will give you guys a little example of that. As always, in my presentations for the people who are new, in the end, we will go to some examples in the wizard, but I like to first explain all the concept using slides. And sometimes I'll throw in a little screenshot here and there, like this one. Overfolding is GTO. We're playing color versus button. 3-bet pot out of position is caller, so we're the caller. We check called a 50% pot c-bet on 10-5-4, which villain does, I think, almost range, like 80-90%. And on the turn, we face a 50% barrel. Now, in terms of barreling sizing, this is something very important to have watched the previous webinars about turn C betting, because there I explained why we shouldn't be betting bigger than 50% in this case. Remember, we are always trying to find the sizing for which our opponent has a tough time defending. So in this case, in position is allowed to barrel range for a half pot sizing. And if you look at the MDF here, would be around 67%, but we're actually only defending 50%. So we're clearly overfolding, but it's GTO. Even though villain is allowed to bet range, okay, and I think in practice, maybe people don't necessarily bet range. Still bet a lot, but range. So I would say that overfolding is definitely GTO. And there's nothing you can do about it. I usually like to call this like the nature of the spot. This is like the nature of the spot is that you just have to overfold. There's nothing you can do about it. Some people who like to fight and kind of ignore the nature of the spot, they end up fighting a bit too much. And here you end up overcalling, and then you're just going to give money to your opponent because he's also allowed to value bet very thin. And on a lot of rivers, we still cannot call, like flush draw rivers, jack, queen, ace, 9. There's a lot of terrible rivers in the deck. So even our equity now, but also, again, our equity in the future, there's a lot of rivers that we simply have to overfold again because of equity switches taking place. All right. So always estimate. And I personally don't really think in this spot in terms of how often I have to defend. I personally try to estimate how strong my opponent's range is, and based on that, I defend. This is a bit more exploitative, but it works also well in theory. In these kind of scenarios, I just realized, well, this is a very good card for my opponent, and his range is very much ahead, so I'm not really going to do a lot of calling. Considerations. Given the equities and the sizing used, how much should we defend? Okay. So sizing used by villain, simply said, the bigger villain bets, the more we are allowed to fold. That's quite straightforward. There is not an exact correct universal percentage. Okay, my guess is that it would look something like this. Obviously, we have the MDF that gives certain guideline. Like I said, if you're in position, usually you can defend a little bit closer. Given that if there's no significant range disadvantage, you can defend a little bit more because of your ability to realize than out of position. But then we have to take off the range disadvantage. If we are very far behind, we have to overfold a little bit. And river maneuverability. Now, this is both in that 4, 5, 10 king example. Like I said, on a lot of rivers, even though we might be ahead with pocket sevens in a vacuum versus the barreling range, for example, on the 10, 5, 4 king. So let's say, I'm not really sure, but let's say maybe if you look at the odds, he's betting half pot. If you put equity of sevens versus this range, maybe that would balance out that we have a call if we look purely at the odds. But, and if he would, for example, if this is an MTT and the guy would just jam the turn, then we should call pocket sevens. But the deeper you are, the more you have to take in consideration that you still have to play a river. Okay. And that reduces your realization. If the guy just bets all in, if the SPR is just half pot, okay, and the game ends here, you might call sevens. I'm just giving an example of sevens. Maybe ace-5 is a better example. Okay. So river maneuverability, that's kind of what I mean with that. From an exploitive perspective, let's say someone is a guy who likes to give up river, so his river barreling frequency is just very low. We get to over-realize. Now, this obviously also would make us defend a little bit more. Okay, and out of that, you will get your defense frequency. But again, like I said, I personally don't really approach the spot from a more. I use theoretical concepts, which I will explain, but I don't really think so much about, okay, I have to defend X of my range because else, you know, my opponent just has a license to bluff. We start folding our lowest EV holdings and work our way up the bigger villain bets. Okay, so usually you think, when you face a bet, you think in terms of your range, where you are in your range. The lower you are in your range and the bigger you bet, the more easy to fold. And usually you start to doubt when you are somewhere in the middle of your range. Okay. So now the question is, what makes up for a low/high EV holding? That's something that we will discuss next. So we don't have to think, we cannot think in terms of, okay, versus an overbet, we always call top pair. Okay, we're thinking now in absolute hand strength. This is also a concept that I will explain. We have to think in relative hand strength. So how strong is our hand relative to the situation? So this can also be the position, how big your opponent bets, your improvability, yada, yada, yada. So how does our hand do against his range? This is a very important question. AKA, what is our EV? I listed 4 points, okay, where the EV of your hand is based on. And based on that, you know, we have to think about the properties our hand has. And the more it has these properties, the more likely it is we're going to defend that hand versus a barrel. Now, we start with equity. Obviously, if you have, like I said, the first thing we have to ask ourselves, does he bet the same hand or worse for value? That would be point number 1. We call or raise, depending on the situation. It kind of falls hand in hand with equity. Usually that hand also has a lot of equity. Obviously, if he sometimes barrels a worse hand, or the equity that hand has is very high. If you look at top pairs, now obviously a lot of in his battering range, let's say, for example, it's a queen high board or king high board, is going to consist of, or at least his value range is going to consist of those top pairs. So if we have the top pair, that makes it less likely he has the top pair, and that increases our equity. So usually the top pairs will have the highest amount of equity. Okay. So that's why usually, okay, top pairs are at least the frequency defend. But which top pair is going to depend on other factors. So improvability, this is a very important one. How does our hand improve? Okay. So especially when we get to the middle pair and third pair type of region or the draw region, we have to be very careful in terms of which hands we want to defend. And we will actually also already see this in top pair region. Because sometimes if you think about, okay, if my hand improves on the river, do I improve to an implied odds hand, meaning that you're going to make a lot of money, or a reverse implied odds hand? So let's say you make 2 pair, but he then makes 32 combos of straights, for example. Now, usually that hand has another thing in common, which is that it usually also blocks some of the bluffs. So let's say the board it has a king and a 9 on it, so it's king 9 5 4 or something. If we have a hand like Jack 9, spoiler alert, these are usually hands that we want to fold, because a lot of villains' barreling range is going to consist around the Jack 10, the Jack Queen region, and then if we would hit the Jack and he has Queen 10, we lose a stack. Okay, so that's kind of the reverse implied odds situation, and it has blockers to the bluffs. Now, and it has poor equity because it's the middle pair. Let's say we have King Jack, it's the top pair. Well, he could even bet King Jack himself, so we don't really fold that hand. Showdown value. Now, this is something more related to, for example, ace high draws or king high draws that we will sometimes pew again on the turn because we have some showdown value versus the barreling range. All right. So this is kind of what the EVs are based on. I will give you guys various examples in a second. Any questions so far about this from the things that I've listed so far before we go into the, oh wait, we have relative versus absolute hand strength first. In order to apply these EV metrics, we have to think in relative hand strength. How strong is our hand relative to the situation instead of absolute hand strength, top pair, second pair, third pair, etc. This kind of thinking doesn't really work in these kind of scenarios. You need an upgrade, which I'm going to give you. All right. So if there's no further question about this, I will go into point number 5, which is actually an extension of point number 2. What is his range? But then from a more exploitative consideration. Actually, no, it's an extension of point number 4. Something has changed in the slide. So usually what I think about in these kind of scenarios is a way more exploitative thought process. I'm not thinking about, okay, he bets X, how I should now defend this proportion of my range. No, I'm thinking about what is his range and can my hand continue versus that range, or what can my hand do versus that range? Okay, because a lot of the defense we will see is based obviously on the way imposition is barreling. Now, you know, we are here to teach more GTO, which is more based on, okay, I just play a solid strategy, and no matter which strategy you play, my strategy will be winning, right? That's kind of the defensive mindset of GTO. But as we all know, you know, ranges are going to look a lot different often in practice, and we will definitely talk about some exploits as well. So when you're reacting to a strategy, I prefer a more exploitative decision-making process. Can I continue versus his range instead of what should I defend here? Okay, what should I defend here is from a GTO perspective. And can I continue versus his range just makes the decision very easily isolated with my hand in a vacuum versus the range I think he is barreling. Okay. Whereas when I'm leading the action, so let's say I'm the raiser in this case, I always lean more towards executing my strategy, aka GTO. So there, my thought process will be less involved around exploitative considerations. Okay. In general, when you study a situation, that's also why I did it in this order, and this is usually how I study. You always start looking at it from the perspective of the raiser. So in the previous webinars, we looked at playing in position or an out position as the raiser, and we learned what the correct strategy is. Like I said, it's also important because usually the raiser strategy, I prefer to play quite GTO. But then now from a responsive perspective, we learned probably a lot of things that were quite unintuitive for humans. And because we now know what is right, which is the GTO play as in his raiser, we also have a very good idea of what the population might do wrong. And we can use our knowledge of that in order to make good exploits. Okay. So what is his range? That is usually the question. Well, obviously we need to then think about, or if you have this information, profile and frequencies of villain on this street and the next. Like I said, some people are less barrel heavy than others. Well, that makes us way more able to call. Some people's range construction, this is very important. So range construction of villain fast street value driven. What I mean with that, and I will give you guys also an example, and we talked about this, I think, in fast playing versus slow playing webinar that I gave. Some people like to play bet check lines. This is actually quite a common, is it league? Yeah, I think definitely a league, especially on a bit lower stakes. People go for bet check lines, especially when boards become scary. They think, okay, I have to get one street of value now. Let's go bet check. I call these fast street value driven lines. And usually what that does is it strengthens the betting range and it weakens the checking range. Then the correct adjustment for us as the defender is we should avoid the betting range and we should attack the checking range. Okay. So we should overfold versus the turn barrel versus someone who's fast street value driven. And we should attack when he checks because that line is going to be too weak. Okay. Now, we also have to ask the type of bluffs. Now, this is why we have to study theory, where we talked a lot about equity, right? Equity-driven bluffs. We talked about unblockers, and we talked about like some YOLO type of bluffs. If there are situations where the bluffs that villain is supposed to show up with are very unintuitive, it's very likely he will miss them, which will strengthen his betting range, or it will make his range too equity-driven, okay? Now, both have certain consequences. And last but not least is bluff allowance. We also talked about that, where especially on boards like 3-5-9 queen, where there's just a lot of draws present to choose from. We saw that in theory, we don't barrel all these draws, okay? We would just be significantly over barreling. So people would need to use an RNG of some sorts in order to keep their frequencies intact, which is very hard to do. Okay, so again, exploitative consideration is, can I continue versus his range and tendencies instead of what range should I defend here versus this sizing, which is way more GTO driven. All right. Did I miss a point here? Freaks a villain. No, I think oh yeah. Also in general, does he put enough bluffs in the turn barrel line? That's very important. Because if his range doesn't have enough bluffs on the turn, his river barreling frequency will just be very high, which will cost us our equity realization. So again, then you get the situation where maybe our odds right now, if you compare our hand's equity with the odds, maybe our hand is still good, but if he will barrel the river 80% and we always have to fold, we still have a minus if he call, because we still have to play a river. And this all goes true for the flop as well, right? All right, I'm now gonna, I've separated a bunch of boards where we're gonna look at these concepts in play. Okay. So the first board I separated for you guys is an ace-9-6 board. We're playing button versus big blind. I think I use that for most of the examples as it's the most common spot. And I think, you know, the spot that is, the more common the spot, the more important it is that you play it well. But usually the concepts will apply in all situations. Again, we have to think in relative hand strength. So obviously when ranges become a bit tighter, like under the gun, certain hands start to be valued more than less. Like it's not like all top pairs are equal, right? Because, for example, he might not barrel king jack on a king high board for value under the gun, but he might do it on the button. So we don't beat value versus on the gun barreling range, but we beat value versus the button range. But the concepts will still apply. For simplicity's sake, I just made a bet of 1/3, which is actually preferred on this board. Check the turn. Villain is going to barrel somewhere between 125 and 175% of the pot. Think I usually see people go more towards 125. It's also because the board is very rainbow. It's also something that we learned. Because there's no flush draw, we can bet a bit bigger. If we would, for example, say that the turn is a heart, we would most likely, you saw it went down with 3%. We can usually bet it a bit bigger, but let's say he bet 125%. I don't think it really matters for this example. And now we're going to be looking at our turn defending frequency. Now, like I said, we're going to be over folding, I think, slightly if you compare to MDF. That's because we're out of position. Okay. And like I said, if you look at the barreling range, villain has the nut advantage in nines, aces, ace king, ace queen. So we're forced here to overfold. All right. But that's fine. But we still defend, you know, enough. I wonder what changes on turn in terms of defense when flop was 33%. or flop 75%. Yeah. I will get to a bigger flop bet in a second as well. And then I'll answer your question. So on the turn, fill-in bets on the 25. Let's just say on the 25. Let's start with our trash hands. Well, we're usually folding trash, right? The lowest part of a range. The only hand we still continue is the 8-7. All right. Now the 8-7, you would think like, why would we call 8-7? Like, what can we do with it? This is purely implied odds. And most likely villain, we will also construct a dunk betting range for the people, who are interested. Maybe we will dunk like a 9 or something. I talked about dunk betting. I've done a webinar about dunk betting. Here you go. This is kind of where the EV also comes from. It's going to dunk a 9. It's going to dunk a 6. It's probably also going to dunk an ace for a small, because it's dunking for a small sizing. Yeah, it's just always dunking. So that's also why it can call an 8 high draw, because it has a dunking strategy. If you don't have a dunking strategy, then maybe you should consider raising more often. Probably also already on the flop, right? I'm not going to go into the whole dunking tree, even though I'm a big fan of dunking. So that was the trash hands. Let's start at the weak hands. Now, the weak hands start to become interesting in terms of like certain concepts. If you look at the trend, and this is a trend that we will see, you will see that we will call the stronger 6x and stronger 9x more often. Okay, this is actually nothing to do with strength. This is everything to do with blockers. Okay, if you look at the turn barreling range here, it's very polarized. So probably the bottom is maybe a frequency of ace jack, or a frequency of ace 10, maybe ace jack plus. So a hand like queen 9 and king 9 reduces villain's value range and makes it more likely it's villain bluffing. Most probably a very high frequency hand that is being barreled on this turn is something like 10-8 or 7-8. So we will almost never defend a hand like 9-10 or 9-8 in this spot. As you can see, 9-8 here is a pure fold, because simply if we have 9-8, it's less likely that our opponent is bluffing because of the card removal, because we have the 8 and we don't have a 9 or king, so it's way more likely he has value. This is as simple as it gets. So how could you simplify this in practice? Now in GTO, obviously it's very important that we don't just always call king 9 and fold queen 9, always go king 6 and fold queen 6, because that would make us very exploitable. That's why in GTO there's always frequencies, because both players know each other's strategy. In practice, you can play a bit more pure. You can generate certain rules for yourself. While usually I'll call the middle pairs with the nut kicker or something. Okay, you could simplify this for yourself. You don't have to call these hands with a certain frequency. Then there is the 6-3 here, which I also thought was interesting. I'm not 100% sure why 6-3. I would intuitively say 6-4. Now, obviously, like 6-7 is for the same reason. It actually is for two reasons, I would say. You could barrel a hand like 7-10 suited or 7-8. Also, if we make a 7, he makes 10-8, which he also has offsuit. So that would be not that great for us. So therefore, we would prefer a hand like 6-4, because it unblocks the bluffs and it improves quite clean. Actually, it prefers 6-3, which I'm a bit surprised of, as it has 5-4, I think, in its barreling range, but not 5-3. So I would have personally leaned towards calling king 6, 6-4, king 9, and fold 6-3. But hey, 6-4 blocks 5-4 probably. Yeah, I guess, but I think it's because it's only a suited combo. So yeah, most probably it's that. Maybe it values that a little bit more. And like if you improve to a 3, it's still very clean. And again, it doesn't really scare anyone. This is actually also something that, especially also in some later boards, we'll take in consideration. If you improve your hand with 6-3, let's say you're in position, you have a king, and let's say the river is a jack, you have ace king, you might be like, fuck, ace jack is a pretty big part of Finn's range after already, having called a turn over bet. So maybe he will check that behind a certain frequency. But if the river is a 3, and you improve to 6-3, ace king is still pretty happy. So that's also what I said, like implied odds. Certain hands just improve cleaner, both from a reversed implied odds perspective, but also from an implied odds perspective in terms of if I hit my hand, Finn is going to consider that actually a blank and still going to value bet thin. All right. This is, for example, if you have higher kickers on the board that don't block draws, that usually makes villain pot control a little bit more, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So this is a trend that we will see with the middle pairs, okay? Blockers, we talked about that. Then we go to good hands. Okay, it's actually considering the middle pair also a good hand. The main fold we're going to make is the ace-8. And that, again, is for the same reason that I explained, blocks most of villains' bluffs, okay? The 10-8 and the 7-8 are going to be very dominant in villains' bluffing range. Therefore, the ace-8 would be the hand that you would mostly fold, okay? We still have to defend quite a lot of ace-x, and that's because the board is very dry, okay? So an ace, relative to this situation, a very dry board, okay, is still a very strong hand. Remember, we defend, so he bets a certain sizing, we have to defend a certain percentage, okay, and we fold from the bottom down, okay, and ace-5 rainbow for ace-5, for example, offsuit on a board so as dry as this is quite high up in your range. Therefore, we don't really fold this hand just yet, okay? But I will now change the board. So, for example, if he bets, we here fold 58%. Can I see how much top pairs we're folding? Can I see that? Yeah, we fold 5% top pairs. But let's say we make this a flush draw. The deuce of spades. And we go to top pair. We're actually allowed to fold 11% of top pairs. Now, why is that? That's because we're still folding around the same percentage, but we're folding from the bottom down. And now, because there's a deuce of spades in here, we have a lot of 9x of spades and 6x of spades that are going to defend versus the bet. So in order to defend properly, okay, we are allowed to fold way more ace-x, which is, you know, it's like a pure bluff catcher. It's behind a villain's value betting range and ahead of villain's bluffs. And it has very poor improvability. But now we have 6x of spades and 9x of spades, which have very high improvability. So we have high implied odds. And therefore, we now prefer to call these hands. And therefore, to not be overcalling, we can now fold other hands. And that would obviously be like some more 9x, more 6x, but also more ace-x. And again, especially the ace-8 is going to be very poor here. Okay. So that was another concept that I wanted to show you guys, right? So you always think about in terms of where you are in your range. So the stronger hands you have, the more strong hands you have in your range, the more you're allowed to, or in this case, relatively strong hands, the more you're allowed to fold like some of these absolute strong hands, like ace-5, for example. In terms of the middle pairs, this is something that I wanted to point out. Like weak hands is considering draws also weekends. So we will still see like some calls with the king 9, queen 9, but they are significantly reduced and we never anymore call king 6 and queen 6. Okay. It's still calling these sometimes. Again, you know, it has to have the 9. If it just always calls the ace and always folds the 9, it can no longer call 7, 8 and donk bet on a 9 river, right? So, you know, again, in practice, it's fine if you would just always fold the 9 when there's a flush draw on the board. And you have the 9x and 6x, and you just always call your ace except for ace-8. It's a fine strategy. Okay. Now, if the turn becomes then even more connected, so let's make it 7 or an 8. 7. We're actually folding a little bit less, because we just have so many good hands to call with. Now we're never anymore calling king 9, right? Because we have way more hands to call with, because now 9-8 is obviously better because it has an open ender, 6-8 has an open ender, yada, yada, yada. It's actually already folding like some 6-8s. That's pretty interesting. And this is also like, this is the thing, like we have a lot of those hands. If we would now always call our 7-8 and our 6-8, then we're going to be over defending, which, you know, because in position, or maybe in this case, a solver knows a strategy, won't be that great because then he will just expand his value betting range. Okay. I don't think people will it's a bit hard to exploit this. I think the main thing that this will allow to do, for example, probably in practice, I would be way more inclined to fold a hand like ace-jack and ace-4. Ace-5 still a draw. yeah, like fold ace jack first overbet and call more often with 6-8. Now this would make my strategy very vulnerable to being merged. So meaning that he can start betting a lot of 9x. For example, 9-10 is probably a great hand to bet here for turn as villain, because I'm going to fold a lot of ace-x. I'm going to overcall with 6-8, for example. But again, you know, probably the person who exploits me on that deserved my money. It's usually what I say. So coming back to the ace jack. Now ace jack, you would say ace jack is still a very strong hand, but the board now becomes so dry that we have a lot of other hands to choose from, and villain is no longer going to be value betting ace jack himself. Okay, even ace king and ace queen, and this is something that you have to be very careful for, and this is why I think ace jack is usually a fold versus most players that you play against. Most players, the fast, what did it say? Fast value driven players, they bet ace king and ace queen here. They make this a 2-street game. They play bet, bet, check. Okay, so then ace jack becomes a pure fold. All right, especially versus those players, it's way more important to call with the draws instead of the static type of top pairs. Then what if, because if you look at the button strategy here, no, actually I was going to look at something else. That's actually also what I thought was interesting. No, we're gonna move to a different board. All right, and see how these concepts apply to different boards, because they do apply to different boards. It's not just very specific for one board. I separate the queen jack 5 next. How would the defense strategy change against someone using one turn c-bet size instead of mixing? Well, it will actually look reasonably similar, because like, so this is actually, it's a very good question what you're asking. Because wizard uses multiple sizings, the actual barreling strategy or the actual c-bet strategy that you might face in practice of someone who plays a pure betting strategy, for example, or only a one sizing strategy, will change a little bit. However, you know, the solver still tries to keep his range construction similar, so it won't change that much. All right. It's especially a downside of multiple sizing sims, especially again, if you look at it from a defense perspective, is more that it compounds a lot to the river, that the river range construction is going to look a lot different, especially in terms of percentage wise in practice. People who use one sizing c-bet strategies than in wizard, for example. Okay. Turn, we face another overbet, and we're gonna highlight, we're gonna do basically the same. We start with trashy hands. Now we have the 9-8. Now this is very, oh, because the 9-8 is an open-ender. Okay, so the 9-8 is gonna play very similar. Obviously, if we would make this a 4, it would not be calling the 9-8, because it's folding the 10-9, and that's because I think 9-8, if you look ahead in terms of the check call dunk line, which is gonna take, probably 9-8 is better than 9-10 from the perspective of not blocking too much folds. So I guess that's a small consideration here, because if we have 8-9, he has a bit more bluffs that are out of folds on the river if we donk. So trash hand again plays quite straightforward. Weak hands, I was gonna say, where is the ace high draws? So the ace high draws, this was something that I said showdown value, are usually called still at a decent frequency. Now we cannot call it at too high of a frequency. That's because imposition is implementing probably like some mergey type of bets. Let me see. Yeah, it's merging mainly with a hand like ace king. So what I mean with, or value bluffing, I think some people call that as well. Basically, it's betting ace king to make us fold like pocket eights and getting called by, for example, ace 10 and king 10. Okay. So because as soon as people don't have merges in their game, okay, and they bet way more like, okay, I either bet king high or lower. Okay, so it doesn't barrel pairs, it only barrels air or value, then hands like ace 10 become very good calls. Okay, because you are always ahead of the bluffs, because he doesn't have any value bluffs. You have improvability, which is very important. So that was a point that I wanted to point out. Then if we look at the weak hands, we will see a similar trend in terms of, like, for example, the 5x. We will see us mainly defending the lower 5x. Again, I would say 5 deuce, 5-3 are going to be hands that I would call mainly. And I would actually always fold 5-8, 5-7. Again, this doesn't really work in theory, but I think this is the way to do it. if we improve to with 5-7 on a 7, he can have all the combos of 8-9 off. Then he is allowed to jam that, and then we're a bit fucked. But if we have 5-3 or 5 deuce and we improve to a 3 or a deuce, that's very clean, right? If villain has queen 10 or king queen, he's like, okay, blank, 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 3 deuce. Okay, blank, nice, bet. And then we suddenly have 2 pair. So I would say defend these hands is fine. Then again, we see the king 6. So the 10-5, do we have 10-6? So the king 6 here is the king and the ace kickers again are the main calls. This is because of equity. So equity versus the bluffing range. So villain's betting range on the turn is mainly going to consist of a lot of king 10s, king 9s, the ace 10, the ace king, these type of hands. And king 6 and ace 6 just has very good equity versus the bluffing range. Okay, this is usually why these kickers they play, and they have blockers to king queen, kings, aces, ace queen, all this type of good stuff. But that's why usually if you want to defend the 5 here, that's kind of the 5 that you go for. You fold all the 5s in the middle, okay, and then you defend the lower 5s again. All right. Then we talked about the ace 10. Now it becomes interesting because now we're getting to good hands, and which good hands will fold. And there I think is something very interesting. Okay. Why king 5 is folding? King 5 is pure folding. Not really sure because it likes king 6. But will I ever have king 6? I would personally not have king 6, I guess. How the hell do we even have king 6? Yeah, I'm not really sure. This is again probably if it's calling also king 5, it's overcalling, and therefore, you know, in position can. Yeah, I would say king. I would call king 5 as well because I don't have pretty king 6. I would probably also call. Apparently also like ace 5, for example. If we call too much ace 5, it's overcalling. But then again, I would never call jack 10. So frequency wise, I would probably still end up roughly the same, but my range construction is different. But you cannot do that in theory or in a solver because it knows your strategy. But you can definitely do that in practice. So in practice, I would say call your king 5, call your 5 deuce and 5-3, fold these. You can call ace 5. I would always fold jack 10 and you'll be fine. All right. And why do we fold jack 10? That was the point that I was getting to. Good hands. So if you look at good hands, this is relative absolute hand strength and all the concept in EV that I explained. Why do we call jack deuce and not jack 10? Well, jack deuce or jack 3, they unblock the bluffing range with the deuce and the 3. All right, that's very important. We have a jack while it blocks some of the value range, so that's good. We improve very clean, a deuce and a 3, you know, bingo. Jack 10 is probably the worst hand together with jack 9 because they block a lot of villains' bluffing range, right? Which is going to usually be 2 cards between the ace and the 9. All right. And if we improve with jack 10 to a river 10, first of all, he could have ace king or 9-8, then we're a bit fucked. And if he has king queen and we river a 10, he's most likely not value betting anymore. So there's not a lot of implied odds in our hand. Okay. So this was what we talked about in the odds. So I would always defend jack deuce and I would always fold jack 10. Okay. Now, if you're curious, like you can look in a solver that's customizable and see what would be then the correct exploit versus your strategy. Like I was saying, like I would always call ace 5. I would always fold jack 10. I would always fold king jack. Now king jack and ace jack are already a little bit better than jack 10 because they have an over, and an over obviously doesn't matter in terms of, you know, you have the same amount of equity versus queen x. But king 10, king 9, ace king, they have less equity versus king jack than versus jack 10. Okay. So if you have a lot of hands that are blocking bluffs, you defend the ones with the higher kicker because they have more equity, right? Because villain's bluff has less equity versus king jack than versus jack 10. All right. So this is how you kind of determine if you are in a situation like this where a lot of your hands block the draws, right? And we cannot fold them all because then we would be overfolding. Then we call that one. Another interesting thing actually that I wanted to point out was the turn is a flush draw. 6. It's actually a concept that I wanted to highlight. That was with the draws. So now obviously there's a flush on the board, so we're more allowed to fold hands like jack 10, jack 9 because we have a bit more jack x of hearts, 5x of hearts. So we again, we have more hands to defend with. We turn some flush draws with ace 8 of hearts. So therefore we can fold a bit more static hands, absolute strong hands like that. But the hands, now if you look at the ace jack, we're folding the one with the ace of hearts. It's the same with the ace 10. We usually fold the one with the ace of hearts. That's because in position, if you look at these barrels with like ace 4 offsuit, for example, ace 3 offsuit, they're usually made with the ace of hearts. So we block too much of villain's bluffs. Okay, and therefore, if you want to decide if you want to call in these kind of spots, you don't really want to block the bluffs with a hand like ace jack. This is in a spot where we play, where it blocks a significant amount of his bluffs, which was very significant here. All right. Then I wanted to make the turn a high card, and that's where also some things become interesting from an exploitative perspective. Because for that, I want to go back to the turn C-bet strategy. I've showed a similar example in slow playing. Why we, for example, slow play Queen Jack. It's a pure check. King Jack is a pure check. Reasonably pure check. Jacks is checking. Queens is sometimes checking. 9-10 is even sometimes checking. So a lot of the strong hands are checking. But what we already concluded, there's a lot of players who play fast play, bet, check. Fast value-driven players. As you can see, the range construction here will look a little bit different, most likely. Also, villain is forced to size down due to the connectedness of the board. Now, if people use bigger sizings than theory is allowed to do, you don't actively exploit that. Okay, this is actually a question I get quite often. Like, okay, he uses a suboptimal sizing. What do I do? In this case, you just do nothing. If he uses 125%, you just follow the same guidelines that I just followed here. You're allowed to fold a lot. And basically, he's now isolating himself versus a very strong range. And that's his strategy declining in EV. There's not anything we have to do about it. Now, obviously, if he makes an error in his range construction, like he bets too much King Jack, he doesn't bet enough 6-7 of diamonds. Why not? YOLO. Then obviously our response will look very different. Okay, so I highlighted this board from an exploitative perspective because these are usually boards that people kind of mess up from both streets. All right. If we then look at the defense frequency, so here he's going to size down a little bit. Let me see what were some interesting points that I wanted to highlight. Let's just start in the bottom again. Trash hands. 10-8 is not pure calling. It's just you. Actually, we didn't really talk about check raising. Turn check raising, it's not that frequent. For example, here it's 8%. Yeah, it involves around the straight, and your bluffs also are involved around the straight. That's kind of how you get to your low frequency check raise. If your hand looks like a straight and cannot really call, like 10-8, that's a good hand to check raise together with the actual straight. All right. If you look at weak hands, probably the 5x, obviously, because there's a flush draw, we just defend all 5x with a flush draw, not much else to do. 10-5, that makes sense. Jack 9 can now fold. But for example, Queen 8 is an absolute stronger hand than, for example, Jack 9. But it actually prefers to fold this one a little bit more frequently, just simply because it doesn't have any improvability and it doesn't have any blockers to the straight. Okay, so when the boards become connected, think a lot more in terms of improvability than in terms of static hand strength. Like, oh, I have top pair. Oh, I have middle pair. No. So the more drawy the board, the more we're going to defend based on improvability. All right. So yeah, especially I would definitely encourage for the people who also have access to like a customizable solver to play around with like some node locks here. You're allowed to fold. There's many players who construct their range here on the turn where you're allowed to fold a lot of hands. Basically, if you have a straight, you can continue. 2 pairs, King 10 still continues, but other than that, yeah, it's probably just fold. Especially also if they then use bigger sizings. So it's a very interesting spot from an exploitative perspective. Then I wanted to look at a board where we start a lower board and where we start with a bigger sizing. So if we look at the 9-6-4, and let's make him start with 3/4. So for example, this is what James was talking about. Like obviously here we can see that the strategy is very mixed, but in this optimal mixed strategy, proportionally, if you would use 75% only or a mixed, proportionally, the range construction will look very similar on the turn. Like in absolute combos, it's different, but in terms of how the combos are distributed, the value bluffs, which type of bluffs, they're still reasonably the same. So you won't see that many changes in like the strategy that we defend. So we call. And let me see what Joshua asked. I wonder what changes on turn in terms of defense when flop was high. A 75% polarized c-bet by villain. We have more slow plays in the second scenario. That should change our strategy, right? Yeah, okay, but we have a bit less slow plays here because the board is a little bit low. Does it change the scenario? But actually, it doesn't really change the scenario. Yeah, in terms of if you think about where you range. So let's say, for example, you decide not to check raise. You're carrying a lot of strong hands to the turn. So you can fold a little bit more weaker hands because you have more strong hands. That I think is the adjustment, or at least adjustment. That's, I guess, the difference. So it makes a big bet. Let's go to turn queen. A card that's not that great for us. And pretty great for him. So he's going to fire a lot, which he's allowed to do. 3/4 sizing. Also some overbets like pot. Pot would be decent here. I would personally actually also lean towards 75, but I guess pot would be pretty optimal. So you bet 75. We go again trash hands. We will probably see similar patterns. Okay, we somehow improve to king 10, but we don't really do anything with it. We don't really block. All we do is block bluffs. So yeah, king 10 I think is, if we got to it, is a pure fold. We're still calling all the draws or raising all the draws. That's fine. I think both plays are fine, especially here. I think barrel frequency will be very high. It's very likely that your opponent's going to be over barreling on a queen turn because it's a scare card. And let's say, for example, on the turn, he has jack 10, he should sometimes check. Well, me included, if I bet it big on the flop and the turn is a queen, that's kind of the best card that I was wishing for. So let's just go for it. Now, jack 10, you know, particularly has also like some interesting check properties, but I would say most people just barrel jack 10. So I think it's likely that this spot maybe gets a little bit over barreled. So then I think check raising becomes a bit better. Now we obviously then in terms of value, we have the turn 2 pair that we also check raise. Let me see, 5-8, 5-7. Again, the open end. Again, there will be a lot of donking involved. So check calling, donking river, especially on the 9, the 6, the 4. But probably also on a blank, seeing how much air we call. We probably have a small donking strategy on the river. No, we don't. Okay, interesting. So only on like improving cards, maybe a 3. Sorry, guys, I'm getting creative off topic. 5. Okay, so only board pairs. 6. There we go. So you call the 7-8 and rip the 6 river. That's a nice play. It's a very nice play. So that's how you play the non-showdown value draws. You just call and ship rivers. Good luck. Good luck for the people going out there shipping rivers. Weekends, that's where it gets interesting. We will probably see similar trends. So here, the king 9 versus the 9-10, for example, is a trend that we can see. The king 9 will have more equity versus the bluffing range than a hand like 10-9 or jack 9. Therefore, king 9 will pure call. Ace 9, I guess, is more of a call because it unblocks the bluffs and it blocks more of the value. That's why that hand would be preferred. 9-8, I mean, a top pair is still pretty strong. So we will see the biggest difference here. We will see that with the middle pair. And like I said, the top pair with the 9, we just block way more value for example, he can have maybe queen 9, but he doesn't have queen 6. Okay, so usually that's usually the top pairs. So in this case, the turn middle pairs, they usually call more because of the blocker properties. Okay, maybe in position even value bets ace 9. Yeah, it value bets ace 9. So therefore, obviously, you're calling way more 9x than 6x. Okay, so mainly in the 6x is going to be interesting, where we see again the jack 6 is clearly the fold, and for example, a hand like 6-3 is clearly a raise or a call. Okay, so this is definitely a trend that you should be implementing. So this one blocks a lot of the bluffs, right? And doesn't really improve that clean, whereas 6-3 improves way more clean and unblocks all the bluffs. All right, so 6-3 over jack 6. That's very important. That's the main trend. We see actually the same trend with the 4, right? But we've seen the trend with all the hands. Are there any good hands that we're folding? I don't think so. So no, from that perspective, it's no longer going to be interesting. Again, if Willem decides to use a suboptimal sizing, like overbet at a higher frequency, or like 150 or 175, we should just be overfolding. Okay, that's like, okay, yeah, we're just allowed to fold way more. Great, that's it. It's not the sizing that puts us in a tough spot, because we're just allowed to overfold. He's betting way too big, given the amount of equity that his range has. Basically, that's why the sizing is not preferred. Let's say the turn is a blank. Ah, yeah, this is actually, so we actually talked about this also from an exploitive perspective, that given the fact that it's a scare cut on a turn, people are going to be very bluff heavy. Very likely that people will over c-bet this turn, and probably also over c-bet the flop with, for example, a hand like jack 10. Especially if people c-bet a lot on this board, this turn will definitely get a lot of over barreled. And this is kind of how I like to think about this spot, is more like, how strong is his range? Well, given the texture, it's very, very likely that he will barrel a little bit too much, right? So we can call a little bit more as well in return. And on that jack, queen, 5, king, it's way more likely that he's barreling too strong and not enough bluff, so we get to overfold. I think that's a way more efficient way to think about, okay, how strong is Winnen's range? And based on that, defend. Now, obviously, you should still use GTO concepts. Like the hands that I then decide to defend with are still based on GTO concept, but the actual frequency might differ. All right. 9-7-4 deuce I wanted to look at. So the turn is a blank. I think it doesn't really change much. So now he can actually bet very big. So now if he would bet 75, that would be the incorrect sizing. And that just allows us to be way more, right? But if he bets very big, that's the sizing that we're in trouble against. So let's say he bets very big. We're probably not going any trash hands anymore. Weekends will probably follow the same trend. Again, the 6-3 is very strong. Oh, wait, that's because it has a draw. So what is a weekend? Well, we don't really have to call much weekends anymore, except for Queen Jack. YOLO live. Queen Jack is calling. We have a flush draw. Okay, these are all flush draws. Weekends. Good hands, then that's where we will see the trend. Again, the ace-9 obviously being in there, because Vin is sometimes betting the same hand. But when the turn is a deuce, especially if we make it offsuit, okay, there's just, actually we should make this a 7, so there's really no draws. If there's really no draws present and the board is very dry, okay, these are not very few situations, we usually defend a little bit more absolute hand strength. Okay, but this is one of the few examples. As you can see, we just defend like basically strong hand, and the weaker our hand gets, the more we're going to start to fold, because there aren't a lot of other properties going on given how dry the board is. Okay, now if we make it 6 of hearts, for example, we get a lot of the relative hand strength improvability becomes very important again, and we're going to defend a lot around the 8, the 5, and we actually get to fold a lot of the jack 9s, queen 9s already straight away, and we would much rather call a hand like 5-4. All right, so this is kind of how I want to get. And again, if people start to bet very big here, yeah, then they're just screwing themselves. All right, It's very likely also that people, if they start to use very big sizings here, there's not a lot of hands that are very natural to start bet. Are you really going to bet a hand like King Jack with a heart for 175? Seems a bit much. So I would say the very big overbet here is a mistake from theory, probably also a mistake in terms of the betting range being too strong. They just see a drawy board. They want to get 2 streets and check the river. It's a very common leak. How do we determine whether in position should size up or down their turn barrels when the board has more draws but no made straight flushes? So for this, I would refer you to watch back my seminars that I did previous month and a month before that on turn C betting. All right. And that's why I said it's important to understand, because then you can adjust correctly when you are the defender. All right. And then I know we're running out of time. People probably want to see the World Cup match, but for the dedicated people, I will give one more example that I thought there was an interesting heuristic, which was Jack 9, 5. Check now 5. Let's say he bets 1/3. Turn was a 4. And he overbets. Now we're in position. So this is in general in position. For example, on the other overbets, we were usually folding around 57%. But now, because we're in position, our actualization will be higher. And therefore, we in general get to defend a bit more close to MDF. So in position, you can defend a little bit more because of actualization. All right. And in general playability. Even though you could also make an argument that out of position, we have the very powerful call 8 high, 10 high, ship river on a pair to board type of play. So I think it was Gus Hansen who once said, I like being out of position because then I can check raise. Yeah, it's a positive way to look at it. I like being out of position because then we can dunk bet. What I wanted to look at here. So you will see very similar concepts coming back. Now do take in consideration that when you play blind versus blind, again, like for example, a top pair, look at best or good hands, I guess that is. We're not really folding much top pairs, and that's just because the ranges are way wider. Okay. And top pair in a wider formation is just a relative stronger hands given the formations that we're in. But I wanted to take a look at the fold frequency of a hand like ace 9. So I talked about folding the flush draw blockers, right? So if we have king 9, it's mainly folding the king of hearts, right? It's calling the 9 of hearts. Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense. The 9, this is a very good concept. The 9 of hearts does not block any of the bluffs, okay? But it does reduce outs of villain if he's bluffing with a flush draw. Okay, the king of hearts does block a lot of the bluffs. So therefore, we just prefer to call the king 9, okay? But if we then look at 5-6, 5-6 now, this concept flips. Why is that? That's why we're going to close it off. I'll close it off with a little question. I already spoiled why the king 9 is a fold with the heart. But why do we flip that with the 5-6? And this is where you can see, like, because obviously you can also make an argument for calling king 9 with the king of hearts. Because then if you hit your king, it's at least not 2 pair over flush. Oh, actually, I already spoiled it. I already spoiled it there. Yes, so 5-6, indeed, it unblocks the bluffs. And with the 6 of hearts, you don't block that many flush draws. And then, and this is actually also something you see with pocket pairs. If we're in a spot, especially usually in single raise spots, when you have the pocket pair, you usually want to defend the one with the flush draw blocker. Because the formations are so wide anyway. And then when ranges become a bit tighter, like 3-bet pots, 4-bet pots, it's quite common that we actually don't want to have the flush draw because it just blocks too many of villain's bluffs. But so yeah, the 6-5 here, the heart is not that relevant because it's a low heart. Then we prefer to have the heart so that when we do make 5-6, it's not on the 6 of hearts where he sometimes makes a flush. All right. So, and like we can go through the sim, but it's the same concepts reapplied that I already spoke to. And you will see this in all sims. That's why when you look at these kind of situations, you don't have to necessarily think like, okay, what do I have to do on Jack 9-5? No, now you know certain heuristics for turn C bets that you have to take in consideration that influence the EV of your hand, right? Good concept to understand how to structure your bluff catching. That's exactly what I was going for. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you guys learned a lot. If there's any French or Moroccans in the chat, probably not. They're now watching football. Good luck to you guys. And good luck to the rest. For the people who in the next week check call the turn with 8 high and ship the river when the board pairs, tag me on Discord and post the hand. I'm curious. Appreciate you and your time. Thank you for doing this. No problem, man. I want to thank everyone for tuning in. Hope these heuristics help for you, and good luck at the tables.